War is often measured in territory gained or lost, but its most dangerous battles are sometimes fought far from the front lines, inside an economy. Today, we're looking at why Russia's war in Ukraine is increasingly becoming an economic time bomb, how sanctions, shrinking revenues, and rising security threats are converging, and why events unfolding from Moscow to Stavropol may signal deeper political consequences for the Kremlin than the battlefield ever could. From the outside, the Kremlin continues to project confidence. Russian officials insist the economy is adapting, military production is expanding, and the state retains full control over financial stability. Even U.S. President Donald Trump's remarks suggesting Russia holds the upper hand in the war echo this narrative of resilience. But a closer look at Russia's economic fundamentals tells a far more fragile story, one that aligns with warnings from the Washington Post that the real economic reckoning may arrive in 2026. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has relied heavily on two pillars to sustain the war effort: accumulated cash reserves and aggressive borrowing. For years, Russia benefited from high energy prices and conservative fiscal policies that built up the National Wealth Fund. That cushion allowed the Kremlin to absorb the initial shock of sanctions in 2022 and 2023. However, by late 2024 and moving into 2025, those reserves have been significantly depleted. What once functioned as a strategic buffer is now a rapidly shrinking safety net. The budgetary strain is becoming increasingly visible. Military spending has surged to historic levels, consuming a growing share of federal expenditures. At the same time, revenues, particularly from oil and gas, are weakening. New and tougher U.S. sanctions aimed squarely at Russia's oil sector have widened the budget deficit and added systemic risks to the financial system. These measures have forced Moscow to sell crude at discounts exceeding $20 per barrel, a steep price for an economy still heavily dependent on energy exports. Major firms such as Rosneft and Lukoil are feeling the pressure, and industry experts warn that Russia's oil and gas sector is sliding into a structural crisis rather than a temporary downturn. This matters politically as much as economically. Energy revenues are not just another income stream, they are the backbone of the Russian state. They fund social programs, regional subsidies, internal security forces, and, crucially, the war itself. As those revenues decline, the Kremlin faces increasingly painful trade-offs: cut civilian spending, increase borrowing, or quietly monetize deficits through inflationary policies. None of these options are politically neutral. Inflation is already eroding living standards. By the end of 2025, prices are expected to continue rising while economic growth slows noticeably. Consumer activity is falling, a trend made starkly visible during preparations for the New Year holidays, traditionally a period of high spending in Russia. Instead of festive consumption, households are tightening their belts, postponing purchases, and adjusting to a new normal of scarcity. This quiet shift in daily life may not yet spark mass protests, but it chips away at the unspoken social contract between the Kremlin and the population: political passivity in exchange for stability. Looking ahead to 2026, economists increasingly agree that this could be the first year when the war becomes an unmistakable economic burden rather than a manageable strain. Risks of corporate defaults and even a broader banking crisis are rising, regardless of whether Putin maintains a hard line in negotiations to end the conflict. While Russia's elite largely believes social unrest will remain contained, history suggests that prolonged economic decline has a way of reshaping political realities, often slowly at first, then all at once. While macroeconomic indicators reveal mounting pressure, the war's second front is unfolding inside Russia itself, through sanctions that bite deeper each month and security incidents that expose the limits of state control. Together, these forces are transforming what the Kremlin presents as a managed wartime economy into a system increasingly vulnerable to shocks, both financial and political. The newest round of U.S. sanctions targeting Russia's oil sector represents a qualitative shift rather than a routine escalation. Unlike earlier measures that focused on access to Western technology or financial markets, these restrictions strike directly at cash flow. Oil is not only Russia's primary export, it is the bloodstream of the federal budget. By forcing deeper discounts, now exceeding $20 per barrel, sanctions are compressing margins at precisely the moment when war spending is peaking. Even large state-linked firms such as Rosneft and Lukoil, long considered insulated by political backing, are now operating under growing strain. This erosion of revenue feeds directly into financial system risk. Banks are increasingly exposed to defense contractors, state-directed loans, and energy companies whose balance sheets are deteriorating. Economists warn that 2026 could see a wave of defaults if current trends continue, potentially triggering a broader banking crisis. Such an outcome would mark a turning point, the first time the war's costs overwhelm the mechanisms Moscow has used to suppress economic fallout. Importantly, this risk exists regardless of whether the Kremlin softens its negotiating stance or doubles down on confrontation. At the same time, internal security incidents are amplifying economic anxiety. In the early hours of a recent night at around 2 a.m., a drone threat alert was issued across Stavropol Krai. Shortly thereafter, residents of Budyonnovsk reported multiple explosions over a 15-minute span. Within minutes, images and videos circulated online showing a massive blaze lighting up the sky. Local telegram channels identified the site as the Stavropol chemical plant, a major producer of polyethylene, benzene, and other critical chemical products. Pro-Ukrainian channels such as Exile Nova Plus compiled visual evidence of the fire, underscoring how quickly information now spreads beyond official control. This was not an isolated incident. Budyonnovsk had already experienced a similar episode on the night of November 12, when explosions were reported during an air raid alert. At that time, residents were instructed to shelter in windowless rooms or spaces between walls, while authorities warned of possible mobile internet restrictions and disruptions to digital terrestrial television. The Russian Ministry of Defense later claimed 4 drones were shot down over Stavropol Krai, yet local channels continued to suggest that the Stavropol plant itself had been targeted. Even earlier, on the evening of October 28, unidentified drones reportedly struck the same enterprise. That same night, Russians reported unknown drones heading toward Moscow, prompting temporary restrictions at Domodedovo and Zhukovsky airports. Similar measures were imposed at airports in Vladikavkaz, Grozny, and Samara, highlighting the geographic breadth of the threat. These incidents matter far beyond their immediate damage. Strategic industrial sites like chemical plants are integral to both civilian supply chains and military production. Repeated disruptions not only undermine output but also challenge the Kremlin's narrative of internal stability and security. Each air raid alert, each airport shutdown, and each viral video of explosions chips away at the perception that the war is distant and contained. The elite may publicly dismiss these events as manageable, but privately they complicate decision-making. Insurance costs rise, logistics become more fragile, and investor confidence, already limited, erodes further. For ordinary citizens, the message is simpler and more unsettling. The war is no longer just something happening over there. It is affecting flights, communications, industrial safety, and daily routines at home. As Russia moves deeper into a protracted war economy, the political consequences of sustained economic pressure are becoming harder to defer. For now, the Kremlin strategy rests on a familiar calculation: absorb short-term pain, prevent elite fragmentation, and rely on repression and propaganda to keep society passive. Yet the convergence of shrinking revenues, financial risk, and internal security shocks suggests that this approach may be reaching its structural limits. Among Russia's political and business elite, expectations remain remarkably static. Most do not anticipate mass protests or an immediate political crisis, even as inflation rises and budget deficits widen. This confidence is rooted in experience. Over the past 2 decades, the state has demonstrated an ability to neutralize dissent, co-opt regional leaders, and redistribute resources selectively to maintain loyalty. However, this elite consensus also reflects a narrowing of strategic imagination. The assumption that society will indefinitely tolerate declining living standards may prove increasingly fragile as economic deterioration becomes persistent rather than cyclical. By the end of 2025, the warning signs are expected to be unmistakable. Military expenditures will continue to dominate federal spending, crowding out investment in healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Oil and gas revenues, already weakened by sanctions and forced discounts, are unlikely to rebound meaningfully under current geopolitical conditions. Economic growth is slowing, while inflation continues to erode real incomes. The visible drop in consumer activity during New Year holiday preparations is more than a seasonal anomaly. It is a snapshot of a population quietly adjusting expectations downward. Historically, such moments do not immediately translate into revolt. Instead, they reshape political behavior in subtler ways. Public enthusiasm gives way to apathy, compliance replaces loyalty, and the legitimacy of leadership becomes increasingly transactional. The Kremlin's power remains intact, but it becomes more expensive to maintain. More subsidies are needed to stabilize regions, more coercion is required to suppress dissent, and more financial engineering is necessary to mask structural weaknesses. This is why 2026 looms so large in economic forecasts. Economists increasingly describe it as the first year when the war's cost may exceed the state's capacity to conceal it. The risk of a banking crisis, driven by defaults and overexposure to sanctioned industries, could force difficult policy choices. Any significant financial shock would ripple quickly through pensions, salaries, and regional budgets, areas that directly affect public trust in the state. This does not guarantee a change in course, let alone a reversal of the war. Authoritarian systems often respond to pressure by tightening control rather than seeking compromise. But sustained economic decline limits strategic flexibility. Negotiations, once framed as a matter of strength, may increasingly become a matter of necessity. Even if Vladimir Putin maintains a hard line publicly, the internal logic of the system may push toward de-escalation or frozen conflict simply to stabilize the economy. At the same time, the growing frequency of drone attacks and industrial disruptions inside Russia reinforces a deeper psychological shift. The war is no longer abstract, and the promise that it can be fought without long-term domestic consequences is losing credibility. Airports closing, chemical plants burning, and communications being restricted are reminders that security, prosperity, and political authority are now tightly intertwined.